In the early hours of the Midway operation, Japanese Naval Command moved within a framework of assumptions shaped less by uncertainty than by continuity. The men directing the operation had come of age in a navy that prized doctrinal coherence and long preparation, and they carried into the Central Pacific a confidence built on recent experience rather than speculation. Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean raids, and the rapid collapse of Allied positions in Southeast Asia had reinforced a belief that initiative, once seized, could be retained through careful sequencing and disciplined execution. Midway was conceived not as a gamble but as an extension of an already validated method. At the core of this thinking lay the expectation of predictability in American behavior. Japanese planners assumed that the loss of battleships at Pearl Harbor had not only reduced U.S. naval strength but also imposed a psychological caution on American commanders. Any American response, they believed, would be reactive, fragmented, and late. The U.S. Navy was expected to protect Hawaii as an asset, not to risk its remaining carriers in a decisive engagement far from secure bases. This assumption allowed Japanese admirals to treat Midway as bait rather than as a contested objective, a place that would draw out the enemy under conditions already shaped by Japanese design. Equally important was the assumption that operational complexity could be controlled through layered planning. The Midway operation combined multiple task forces, dispersed across vast distances, each assigned a precise role. This dispersion was not viewed as a vulnerability but as a means of strategic concealment. Japanese commanders believed that American reconnaissance capabilities were insufficient to assemble a coherent picture of such a distributed force. As long as radio silence was maintained and movements adhered to schedule, surprise was assumed to be durable rather than fleeting. Carrier doctrine further reinforced this confidence. Japanese naval aviation had been trained to deliver concentrated, carefully timed strikes, and admirals trusted that the quality of their aircrews would compensate for any friction encountered during execution. There was a prevailing belief that the first successful strike would determine the engagement's trajectory, rendering subsequent decisions largely procedural. In this context, uncertainty was acknowledged in abstract terms but discounted in practice. Contingencies existed on paper, yet the expectation was that they would not be required. Underlying these operational assumptions was a deeper strategic conviction that the war would be decided through a single, climactic naval battle. This belief, inherited from pre-war planning and reinforced by institutional memory, framed Midway as an opportunity rather than a risk. The operation was intended to thin American carrier strength incrementally, setting conditions for an eventual decisive encounter under even more favorable circumstances. Japanese admirals did not see themselves standing at a crossroads. They believed they were advancing along a path already proven correct. Finally, there was an implicit trust in internal coherence. Commanders assumed that communication between air groups, carriers, and supporting forces would function as designed, that timing would remain elastic enough to absorb delays without altering outcomes. Friction was acknowledged but minimized, treated as an operational inconvenience rather than a strategic variable. As the operation began, Japanese admirals were not braced for surprise. They were oriented toward execution, confident that the enemy would behave as expected and that the structure they had built would hold long enough for events to unfold on their terms. Shortly after dawn, the operational picture began to lose its clean edges. Initial reconnaissance reports arrived not as decisive confirmations but as partial impressions, shaped by distance, weather, and the limitations of hurried observation. A scout aircraft returning from the eastern sector reported signs of American naval presence, yet its language was imprecise, its conclusions tentative. The contact was real enough to be noted, but insufficiently defined to warrant immediate reorientation. For commanders accustomed to clarity through doctrine, the report sat uneasily between warning and noise. As additional messages filtered in, their cumulative effect was not alarm but friction. Time stamps did not align cleanly, bearings were approximate, and aircraft types were either misidentified or left unspecified. Each report required interpretation, and interpretation introduced delay. The assumption that American forces would appear late and in limited strength still framed the analysis, encouraging a reading of the information that minimized its disruptive potential. Doubt entered quietly, not as contradiction, but as an unresolved question embedded within routine communication. On the carrier decks, preparations continued according to schedule, yet the flow of information subtly altered decision-making tempo. Flight officers and air group commanders waited for clarification that did not immediately arrive. The gap between observation and confirmation widened, and with it grew an awareness that the operational environment was less controlled than anticipated. Reports suggested movement where none had been expected, activity in sectors presumed to be empty. Still, the absence of precise numbers allowed these anomalies to be absorbed without structural change. The most unsettling element was not what was known, but what remained unclear. A delayed follow-up report, caused by radio transmission issues and navigational uncertainty, created a pause during which assumptions were tested but not yet discarded. Japanese commanders had planned for enemy reaction, but not for ambiguity in detection. The doctrine emphasized decisive action based on reliable intelligence. Here, intelligence arrived incomplete, forcing choices to be made in its shadow. This did not provoke immediate reversal, but it introduced hesitation into a system designed to operate with momentum. Within command spaces, the tone shifted almost imperceptibly. Orders were issued with added qualifiers, phrased to preserve flexibility rather than enforce commitment. The language reflected caution without openly acknowledging doubt. Officers revisited earlier estimates, not to challenge them outright, but to reconcile them with new inputs that resisted neat categorization. The possibility that American carriers were closer or more numerous than expected remained unspoken but present, influencing timing and sequencing decisions. As the morning progressed, the pattern of reports suggested persistence rather than coincidence. Sightings overlapped geographically in ways that strained the original narrative. Each individual message could still be explained away, but together they formed a mosaic that no longer fit comfortably within established expectations. The confidence that reconnaissance superiority would guarantee surprise weakened, replaced by a growing recognition that the enemy might be acting with greater initiative. This emerging doubt did not immediately translate into decisive action. Institutional discipline and respect for planning constrained rapid deviation. Commanders weighed the cost of altering course against the risk of overreacting to uncertain data. The operational plan had been constructed with precision, and dismantling its sequence based on ambiguous reports carried its own dangers. Yet the psychological balance had shifted. The certainty that once governed interpretation was eroding, replaced by a guarded attentiveness to possibility. By mid-morning, the first reports had accomplished something subtle but irreversible. They had broken the illusion of a fully knowable battlefield. Japanese admirals were still executing their plan, but they were now doing so under a growing awareness that key assumptions might not hold. Doubt had entered not through dramatic revelation, but through the slow accumulation of incomplete information, forcing leaders to confront the limits of foresight while still bound to decisions already in motion. The decisive shift occurred not with a single report, but with the alignment of several that could no longer be treated as independent irregularities. A delayed reconnaissance message was clarified, its earlier ambiguity narrowed by additional detail that removed the margin for optimistic interpretation. Bearings converged. Movement patterns repeated. What had appeared as scattered indications now occupied the same operational space, at the same time, in ways that suggested coordination rather than chance. For the first time that morning, the information arriving at command was mutually reinforcing. Within the flagship's operations center, the tempo of analysis slowed rather than accelerated. Officers recalculated distances and timings already assumed to be settled, tracing projected flight paths against revised estimates of enemy position. The numbers did not align with expectation. If American carriers were present where the reports now placed them, they were neither retreating nor hesitating. They were advancing with intent. This realization did not require speculation. It emerged directly from the data as it stood. The implication was immediate and uncomfortable. The assumption of delayed American reaction collapsed under its own weight. The enemy was not responding to Japanese initiative but had anticipated it. The spatial relationship between forces suggested foreknowledge, or at least preparedness that exceeded prior estimates. For commanders trained to think in terms of sequential escalation, this simultaneity was destabilizing. It meant that the battle space was already contested, even as Japanese aircraft were still being armed and positioned according to the original plan. Communications between task groups reflected the change in perception. Queries replaced confirmations. Requests for clarification were issued with an urgency that betrayed their underlying purpose. The possibility that the enemy had achieved tactical surprise inverted the psychological balance of the operation. Japanese admirals had designed Midway to force exposure under controlled conditions. Now they faced the prospect that exposure was mutual and that the initiative was no longer securely theirs. What made the moment undeniable was not fear, but coherence. The reports no longer required interpretive generosity to fit together. They described a single operational reality that contradicted the premise on which earlier decisions had been made. American carrier aircraft were not distant threats but proximate ones. The timing windows assumed safe for deck operations narrowed sharply. Calculations of readiness, once generous, became restrictive. This recognition did not produce immediate chaos. Discipline held. Orders were not rescinded in panic, nor was the plan abandoned outright. Instead, the command structure hesitated at the edge of alteration. Leaders weighed whether adaptation was still possible within the existing framework, or whether the framework itself had become a liability. Every option carried risk, but the balance of those risks had shifted. The cost of inaction now rivaled the cost of deviation. The awareness of potential ambush introduced a psychological compression of time. Decisions that had been scheduled sequentially now competed for immediacy. Aircraft already committed to one purpose were reconsidered for another, not because doctrine allowed it easily, but because the operational environment demanded it. The enemy's unseen presence exerted pressure without requiring direct engagement. It was enough to be known. For the first time since the operation began, Japanese commanders confronted the possibility that their planning advantage had been neutralized before contact. The belief that intelligence superiority would persist through execution proved unfounded. Surprise, once assumed durable, revealed itself as transient. The operational picture no longer belonged exclusively to those who had drawn it. This moment marked a quiet crossing. The operation continued, but it did so under altered assumptions that could not be reversed. The realization of ambush did not arrive with drama or declaration. It settled instead through recognition, as the weight of converging signals displaced confidence with calculation. From that point forward, decisions were no longer made in expectation of control, but in response to constraint, shaped by the understanding that the enemy was already present, already positioned, and already prepared to act. The recognition did not announce itself with raised voices or overt alarm. It entered the command spaces through brief exchanges, clipped acknowledgments, and pauses that extended longer than procedure required. An admiral read a report aloud, then repeated a single bearing, slower the second time, as if testing its implication before allowing it to settle. Another officer responded not with contradiction, but with a restrained confirmation, his phrasing careful, his tone neutral. The language remained formal, yet its cadence changed. What had been routine now carried weight. Questions followed, direct but measured. Distances were restated. Times were recalculated verbally, each figure spoken as much for collective alignment as for accuracy. An admiral asked whether the contact had been verified twice, not because he expected a different answer, but because the question itself bought a moment of orientation. The reply was concise. The room absorbed it without comment. No one rushed to reinterpret the information. Silence, brief and deliberate, did the work of acceptance. When orders were discussed, they were framed as considerations rather than directives. An admiral noted that deck cycles were exposed longer than anticipated. Another observed that American aircraft ranges now overlapped assumptions previously treated as margins. These were statements, not arguments. They were offered into the shared space, allowing their implications to stand without elaboration. The absence of rhetorical force underscored the seriousness of the moment. Nothing needed to be emphasized. There were subtle signs of internal recalibration. A chief of staff adjusted the phrasing of a recommendation mid-sentence, replacing certainty with conditional language. An admiral acknowledged the change with a slight nod, signaling comprehension without endorsement. The exchange conveyed more than agreement or disagreement. It reflected an understanding that the situation had moved beyond doctrine into judgment. Each word carried the awareness that decisions now bore immediate consequence. The possibility of ambush was not declared outright. It emerged indirectly through a remark about timing windows narrowing, through an observation that enemy initiative appeared coordinated. One admiral used the phrase earlier than expected, allowing its understatement to convey magnitude. Another responded by noting that expectations themselves might require revision. The acknowledgement was restrained, but unmistakable. The framework guiding the operation had shifted, and everyone present understood it. Responsibility weighed visibly in these exchanges. No one sought to assign error. The focus remained on the present, on what could still be influenced. Yet beneath the professionalism lay a recognition that prior confidence had constrained perception. An admiral remarked that the enemy's disposition suggested preparation rather than reaction. The statement hung briefly before being accepted without challenge. It did not accuse, it recalibrated. As discussions continued, the rhythm of speech slowed. Each contribution was measured, stripped of excess. Officers avoided overlapping remarks, allowing space between sentences. This discipline was not imposed, it was instinctive. The awareness that misinterpretation could now be decisive encouraged restraint. Even disagreement, when it appeared, was expressed softly, framed as inquiry rather than opposition. What united these reactions was their inward focus. The admirals were not grappling with shock, but with consequence. Their words reflected a collective turn from expectation to reality, from planning to adaptation. The emotional register remained controlled, yet the stakes were evident in the care taken with language. Every phrase was weighed against the possibility that it might prompt irreversible action. In this moment, leadership revealed itself not through command, but through composure. The realization had settled, and with it came a shared understanding that the operation was no longer unfolding as envisioned. The admirals spoke quietly, precisely, and with an economy that acknowledged both uncertainty and duty. Their reactions did not dramatize the situation. They contained it, marking the point at which confidence gave way to calculation, and words became the first instrument of adjustment. By mid-morning, the atmosphere within the command spaces had altered in ways that required no announcement. Confidence, once embedded in posture and pace, receded into something more contained. Speech became economical, stripped of projection. Earlier assurances, casually reinforced by habit, gave way to careful phrasing that acknowledged limits without naming them. Admirals who had spoken in declarative terms now framed observations with qualifiers, not as hedges, but as acknowledgments of a narrowing margin. The operational environment was being remeasured, and the language adjusted accordingly. This restraint manifested first in how possibilities were handled. Where confidence had encouraged dismissal of unfavorable variables, restraint allowed them to remain present without resolution. Enemy proximity was discussed as a factor to be managed rather than a problem to be dismissed. Timelines were reconsidered aloud, not to restore certainty, but to understand exposure. An admiral noted that recovery windows might overlap with potential enemy approach vectors, then stopped. No conclusion followed. The silence that met the remark indicated agreement without endorsement of a solution. The room accepted complexity as a condition, not an obstacle. The tone of exchanges reflected a collective recalibration of responsibility. Confidence had distributed risk across the plan. Restraint localized it within each decision. Officers spoke with an awareness that every adjustment would carry trade-offs, and that those trade-offs could not be deferred. The earlier sense that outcomes were being guided by momentum faded, replaced by an understanding that momentum itself required supervision. Even routine procedural language was delivered with greater deliberation, as if precision in speech might impose order on a situation increasingly resistant to it. This shift did not produce paralysis. On the contrary, it sharpened attention. Admirals listened more closely to subordinate assessments, allowing reports to stand without immediate synthesis. The hierarchy remained intact, but it functioned less as a conduit for affirmation and more as a filter for consequence. When recommendations were offered, they were framed narrowly, confined to what could be justified in the moment. Broad strategic assertions disappeared. The focus tightened around immediate operational exposure, deck readiness, and air group availability, each discussed in isolation before being tentatively reconnected. Restraint also altered the emotional register without making it visible. The confidence that had permitted ease was replaced by composure maintained through discipline. No one expressed doubt openly, yet doubt informed the cadence of every exchange. The absence of visible anxiety was itself a form of control, an effort to preserve decision-making clarity under conditions that no longer supported optimism. Admirals modulated their presence, aware that tone could influence execution as much as orders. As consequences were assessed, the language of inevitability began to surface, not as fatalism, but as acknowledgement. Certain options were no longer available. Certain sequences could no longer be protected. These realizations were not debated, they were noted. An admiral remarked that exposure time was now a variable rather than a constant. Another replied that mitigation would require trade-offs elsewhere. The exchange ended there, its implications understood. Restraint meant accepting loss of flexibility without dramatizing it. The shift was most evident in what was left unsaid. Confidence had encouraged projection into favorable futures. Restraint confined attention to the present. Admirals avoided speculation beyond the immediate horizon. Even success, when mentioned, was described in conditional terms. The language reflected an understanding that outcomes would be shaped by interaction rather than design. Control was no longer assumed, it was being negotiated in real time. In this atmosphere, leadership expressed itself through measured presence rather than assertion. The tone conveyed seriousness without urgency, gravity without alarm. Decisions continued to be made, but they were framed as responses rather than affirmations. The quiet recalibration from confidence to restraint did not signal weakness. It marked a recognition that authority now rested not in expectation, but in judgment exercised under constraint, with consequences fully acknowledged and deliberately borne. Understanding arrived not as revelation, but as acceptance. By the time the full operational picture could be assembled, the space for reinterpretation had closed. The remaining reports no longer added new dimensions. They confirmed what had already been inferred. Enemy carriers were present in strength, positioned within effective striking distance, and operating with coordination that precluded coincidence. The earlier ambiguity that had allowed for restraint dissolved into clarity, and with it came an acknowledgement that certain decisions, already taken, could not be retrieved. Within command spaces, this recognition altered the character of discussion once more. Language became sparse, almost austere. Admirals no longer explored alternatives at length. Instead, they identified points at which earlier assumptions had diverged from reality. These acknowledgments were not framed as confessions, nor were they personalized. Error was discussed as systemic rather than individual, embedded in doctrine, expectation, and sequence. One officer noted that surprise had been assumed to persist longer than it could. Another observed that dispersion, once considered protective, had delayed mutual support. Each statement was received without rebuttal. What distinguished this moment was the absence of defensiveness. There was no effort to justify prior choices through circumstance or misfortune. The focus remained on consequence rather than cause. Admirals spoke of timing lost and opportunities foreclosed, not to lament them, but to define the parameters now imposed. The realization that the enemy had seized initiative early in the operation was treated as a fact to be integrated, not an injustice to be contested. Inevitability entered the discourse quietly. It was implied in references to depleted margins, to aircraft committed beyond recall, to cycles already in motion. An admiral remarked that even immediate adjustment would not restore parity. The statement carried weight precisely because it was understated. No one challenged it. The acknowledgement did not imply surrender of agency, but it did concede that agency now operated within severe constraint. Outcomes would be influenced, but not fully directed. This acceptance extended to the emotional discipline of command. Voices remained steady. Orders continued to be issued with precision. Yet beneath the procedural continuity lay an understanding that the strategic balance had shifted irreversibly. The earlier expectation that skillful execution could compensate for surprise loss no longer held. Skill would now determine degree rather than direction. This distinction was understood without being articulated. As the situation was fully comprehended, responsibility was internalized rather than dispersed. Admirals did not seek external explanations in weather, chance, or enemy advantage alone. They recognized that planning assumptions had narrowed perception, that confidence in method had delayed recognition of deviation. One officer noted that the enemy had been granted less imagination than was warranted. The observation was not rhetorical. It was diagnostic. The language of inevitability did not absolve decision-makers of duty. On the contrary, it clarified it. With fewer illusions remaining, choices could be made with clearer awareness of cost. The task shifted from preservation of advantage to management of loss. This transition was neither dramatized nor resisted. It was accepted as the natural consequence of the information now available. In these final acknowledgments, there was a sense of closure, not to the operation itself, but to the phase of belief that had preceded it. The admirals understood that they were no longer operating within a framework of expectation, but within one of consequence. The enemy's presence, once theoretical, was now definitive. The limits of foresight had been reached. What remained was execution under conditions fully understood. The acceptance of error did not weaken command authority, it refined it. By recognizing inevitability, leaders removed the burden of false hope from their decisions. They acted not to reclaim what had been lost, but to contend responsibly with what could no longer be avoided. In that restraint lay the final clarity of command, shaped by recognition rather than surprise, and sustained by an unspoken agreement to face consequence without illusion.